Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Janelle. I am the Secretary of the Rochester Regional Coalition Against Human Trafficking. I would like to introduce Melanie Blow. Melanie Blow is the COO of the Stop Abuse campaign. She is a survivor of incest, psychological abuse, and a host of other childhood trauma. She now uses her talents to prevent adverse childhood experiences. After getting a Bachelor's of Science in Biochemistry from SUNY Geneseo, she worked for the American Red Cross Biomedical Services for 15 years. Melanie has experience organizing survivors and empowering them to discuss their abuse and advocate for social change. She has been involved with the New York Coalition to Protect Children, the Fighting for Children Political Action Committee, the Rochester Regional Coalition Against Human Trafficking, us, the Rochester chapter of Love 146, the Legislative Advocacy Committee of the American Professional Society of the Abuse of Children, the Trauma Informed Community Initiative of Western New York, and served on the board of directors for Prevent Child Abuse New York. She has over a decade of legislative advocacy regarding children's issues, and she has been published in newspapers, magazines, and blogs. So top that, welcome, Melanie. I wanted to let everybody know first that this will be recorded and a link will be sent to all attendees within a couple of days. Closed captioning is available. Please click on the CC at the bottom of your screen to turn the captions on. And please also input any questions you have. We will have a Q&A portion at the end. We are very happy to answer your questions, so please put those in the chat box. We will make sure to answer as many questions as we can. So thank you so much, Melanie. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the lofty introduction. You want to show the first slide? And before we actually get into this, I just want to, first of all, thank all of you for spending your evening with us. And just want to say, so we are going to be talking about child sex trafficking. We're going to be talking about child sexual abuse. We're going to be touching on some ugly racial and sexual stereotypes in this. I just want to give everyone that little bit of a warning. If anything that you hear or see today is upsetting or triggering, do what you need to do. If you have to step away for a moment, that's perfectly fine. Again, that's one of the beauties about recording stuff. So, the weaponization of child sex trafficking, what it says about us, and what the anti-trafficking movement needs to know. So a really quick little story about why I decided to do this. In the fall, I thought this might be a fun thing to talk about. We were kind of kicking around ideas about webinars that the coalition could do. And then I started losing interest in it. Facebook started their misinformation actions. So a lot of these really destructive and scary memes that had been circulating stopped, or they slowed down, and I'm like, I don't need to worry about this. And then January 6th happened, and we all got to watch QAnon supporters storming the Capitol. And I realized that we really still do need to keep talking about this, because human trafficking, child sex trafficking, and child sex abuse has actually worked its way has become a national myth, a cultural myth, because it serves a need in our culture. And as long as that's happening, people are going to keep behaving badly about this. It's going to keep motivating people's behavior. So we need to talk about it. So here we are. Okay, next slide. Okay, so a very, very brief history of child sexual abuse in the United States. So from time immemorial until 1973, child sexual abuse was extremely common in our society. We have now mountains of empirical evidence that shows people who were born in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s were sexually abused. People who were older than them were sexually abusing them. So this is not new. It has been an unutterable taboo in our society for a very, very long time. In 1974, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act passed. That gave a federal mandate that children who were being abused, even if they were being abused by their own family, had to be removed by the federal government under certain circumstances. And the federal government had not just the right, but the obligation to intervene. It was, CAPTA doesn't do all that much today. Most people don't like it, but it was a watershed moment that it said children have rights distinct from being the property of their parents. Just because you produced a child does not mean you can do anything you want to them. And it was really the first piece of federal legislation that codified that. So we go from time immemorial, 1974, without much happening. 1984, just 10 years later, Eaton Patz was kidnapped. He was this young boy. The details of his murder were just released a few years ago, but he was kidnapped. It was a very, very huge story. It got people talking about child sexual abuse, which was not what spurred CAPTA to be passed. It kind of got people talking about child sexual abuse. And that same year, the McMartin preschool scandal also happened. The McMartin preschool scandal started out with a child saying something that could very logically be interpreted as disclosing sexual abuse. A lot of what's today considered very bad interview practices were engaged in. It became, last I saw, the longest, most expensive trial in American history. It did not result in any convictions, but it got people talking about child sexual abuse. It got people talking about child sexual abuse in a very fantastical way, because as these kids are being poorly interviewed, not only were they describing sexual abuse, they started describing all this fantastical stuff about sacrificing animals and sacrificing babies. And it got whipped into a lot of other stuff. And it very quickly, so something we hadn't been talking about much since time immemorial, we started talking about, and we were immediately talking about it in a way that helped make it into sort of a cultural myth. We're going to get back to that a little bit later. So then there were similar scandals to McMartin. There's a couple here and there in huge, huge media events. Some of them ended in convictions, some of them didn't. Looking back on it, most of them started with something that sounded, with what probably was a very credible disclosure from a child, but a lot of poor investigative practices. And then after about 10 years of that, by about the early 90s, the table had turned, the pendulum had swung very strongly the other way. And we went from being able to convict adults with badly facilitated child testimony to not being able to ever convict anyone with nothing except very, very good testimony from a child. But we still were talking about it. We were still talking about child sexual abuse. In 1998, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study was published. That was a retrospective study of middle-aged adults. These are the people who were born in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that demonstrated that, yes, indeed, a lot of people back then were sexually abused. 20% of the populace, 25% of women, 15% of men had said they experienced this. Other studies have actually given us those numbers since then, but the Adverse Childhood Experiences study was the first big one that proved just how really, really, really common this is. And unlike all these other things, that was not a media circus. No, people are still learning about that body of research today. But child sexual abuse still stayed in the public radar, kind of ebbing and flowing, but it still was there. In the year 2000, the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act got passed. This was federal legislation that started out as being geared towards what federal agents were seeing as people being brought into the country to engage in sex work and other things as well, but including this engaging in sex work, that they realized there was more to this. It wasn't just simple smuggling. There was a level of coercion in there. So a lot of smart people and a lot of politicians got together and kind of patched out the definition of human trafficking as we know it today, which is anytime force, fraud, or coercion is used to extract labor from an adult, anytime force, fraud, or coercion is used to extract commercial sex from an adult, or anytime a minor is engaged in a commercial sex act. To reiterate, this was not the first time that people were aware of minors engaging in commercial sex acts, but now we had a different vocabulary to talk about it. And that was really helpful. So next slide, please. So what we see in our discussion of several hundred years of how we talk about child sex abuse, we start talking about the rarest versions of it. We start talking about, like kidnapping by strangers, like poor Eaton Pats, who, by the way, I'm going to give a couple of statistics in this one. There's about 100 kids are kidnapped by strangers every year. Sometimes that goes up by a dozen or more, sometimes it goes down by a dozen or more. It's a very, 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 very small number. But it kind of spurred the whole movement into existence. So while this is a very small number of kids, it's certainly something we pay attention to when we talk about. This whole topic is very easy to sensationalize. It's very easy for it to be assigned moral and religious elements. And we talk about it a lot in times of great cultural change. There have been masses of smart people who've written masses of great stuff about all the cultural stuff that was going on in the 80s when the whole satanic panic was going on, or when it started. I'm not going to get into that. They did the research, not me. But it is really important to look at the trends that have got us talking about child sex abuse, to look at what was going on culturally. And we see that this mixture of the real stuff, the children who are actually being harmed, mixed with all this stuff that clearly wasn't happening, but our perception of it is influenced by what else is going on. And it very clearly became a modern day myth. Myths in a sociological sense exist to tell cultural truths. They exist to describe things that are hard to describe otherwise. And so that's what has been happening with child sex abuse, really, ever since we started talking about it, ever since the 70s. A very real crime and a very significant and very real social issue became a cultural myth, along with it being a real issue. So there's real child sexual abuse as it's experienced by individuals, but there's this myth that it plays in our culture, and it's a myth that involves imbalance of power, and it involves good and evil, all this great stuff. So getting back to the year 2000, when we started talking about human trafficking, which kind of how the direction this myth started spinning in. Commercial child sexual abuse has been going on for a very long time. I learned some great stories about it while I was doing research for this project. The age of consent in the United States used to be 10, as it was in Europe, and that was the age at which nobody really cared if a kid was working in a brothel or not. So kids engaged in sex work this has been going on for a while. When the vocabulary around human trafficking, when that concept was coined and when it was getting solidified and put in the public consciousness, it started giving people who work with trafficking victims a different way to talk about it. So here, next slide. So child sex trafficking victims in the real world, they're not the most sympathetic victims. And that's one of the things that had made organizations that have been working with them forever, like Covenant House. They had to kind of stretch some things on their newsletters a little bit. Sex trafficking victims have usually experienced prior sexual abuse. They've usually experienced significant non-sexual abuse. They've usually been in foster care. They're almost always teenagers. GLBTQI population is very, very overly represented. And they usually enter the commercial sex trade by being seduced, quote unquote, or by being seduced somehow. Some procurer has approached them and told them more or less what they want them to do. And the young person thinks this is a better opportunity for them than what their current life is. When you look at the details of what their life is usually like before they start this, that makes a little bit of sense. That picture is of actress Charlize Theron portraying Aileen Warmis in the movie Monster. No sex trafficking victims have been exploited in the making of this presentation. Okay, next slide. But since sex trafficking became the newest piece of this child sex abuse cultural myth, we ended up tacking it on to a lot of other cultural baggage that we already have. And it became, it again started just kind of taking on a mind of its own. It started getting tacked on to a lot of other stuff. This picture really shows in a lot of ways what this evolved into. You'll see this is a very young looking child who looks like, has a hand over her mouth, and the hand just so happens to have a lot more pigment than the child does. So that's playing into racial stereotypes that we already have in this country, stereotypes about who's violent in our country. And it also is showing a child being kidnapped with the subtext that, this is how trafficking happens. So this is, again, building on a lot of stuff that we've had, a lot of myth in our culture between racial mythology and between the whole mythos of children being kidnapped, and that's how bad things happen to them. Okay, next slide. So this didn't just happen randomly. We certainly have had things in cultural underpinnings that might have gotten us there anyway, but it didn't entirely just happen randomly. Child trafficking victims are not necessarily the most sympathetic victims. So people who have been trying to, whether it's agencies who are trying to get financial support, people who are trying to raise awareness, there's the tendency to exaggerate the youth of how young children are when they're involved, to try to really focus on the few cases when kidnapping is involved. We talk about how this can happen to the girl next door. Well, yes, it can, but what we don't talk about is the girl next door could be living a bad life before she's approached by a trafficker. Anti-trafficking organizations tend to display ignorance about the role and scope of non-commercial sexual abuse. So remember 7, 8, 9 years ago when Pokemon Go first got introduced. Was the first big augmented reality game where kids are going to go around following maps on their phones to find these electronic critters. And the game designers were whatever artificial intelligence they used to have these electronic critters appear on the maps. Sometimes they were coming up physically near the houses of registered sex offenders. And that some media outlet picked up on it, and there was a big flap about that. And all of the big organizations in the country that educate about child sex abuse were issuing statements. Okay, this isn't really anything you worry about. Having a child walk past a sex offender's house isn't really a bad thing. And they were using it to educate about real risk factors for child sexual abuse. An anti-trafficking organization that was very prominent and otherwise very respectable put out a statement talking about how horrible this is and how this is just going to mean more kids are going to get kidnapped and and more kids are going to get trafficked, and completely doing the wrong thing with it. And it not only was it giving the public mixed messages, their message is a lot more emotional. The message that, oh, your kids are in danger if they do something like this, is a lot easier for people to process than the message of, no, there's other things that are dangerous. This is not the one. The other thing that the anti-trafficking world has been guilty of is conflating a lot of statistics. Human trafficking is not something we have masses of statistics about. And just like any other crime, I mean, people don't admit to it on, their governmental records that this is how they make their money. So we don't always have good numbers. What you will see if you look at a lot of human trafficking organizations' websites is we wind up conflating statistics about different kinds of trafficking, different kinds of victims, and national versus international stuff. No one is being dishonest, and I don't think most of them are even doing it doing it purposefully. But it causes a lot of confusion in the public's mind about how the scope of this issue. Okay, next slide. Okay, so human trafficking, this whole myth of human trafficking, not looking at it as a real issue, but looking at the kind of the cultural myth. Who does it appeal to? We've got these great stories about, it's this great myth about right and wrong, about people with power versus people without. So it's appealing to anyone who works with children's issues. It's appealing to feminists. It appeals to proponents of economic justice, to proponents of victims' rights. And it very quickly got wrapped in the language of emancipation from slavery. So that's great. These are fantastic things. Also, it became very appealing to, is a way for people who would otherwise blame victims of violence, because the concept of force, fraud, and coercion is built into it. This was something that people who would otherwise blame victims of sexual violence for, they could open up to this, because it started out with discussions of people coming in from the southern border, because we started wrapping it in racial stereotypes very quickly. This became something that xenophobes and racists appealed to, because it quickly got, because of things like that Pokemon Go stories, quickly got conflated with technology and smartphones and all that stuff. People who fear that started getting worked up about this, and just people with a very, very traditional belief system. So So one of the things that started, say, this is great. This, so it became this thing that everyone could talk about, human trafficking. Oh, that's bad, that's bad. And for a while, that was kind of okay. For a while, legislators in red states and in blue states are all passing good stuff to protect trafficking victims. Bills in states like New York, which is more purple than people realize, they're getting bipartisan support. It seemed like we had found one thing that everyone could agree on. And okay, that's, if you've got everybody agreeing on something in the world of politics, you keep it there. That doesn't happen very often. So, okay, next slide, please. Okay, so between 2000 and 2015, the human trafficking, kind of the human trafficking myth, what kind of happened was it just kind of kept kicking along. We had countless documentaries about it. We had countless dramatic films based on it. And our broader culture was changing. American politics started radicalizing. Social media and technology were playing a greater and greater role in our day-to-day lives. Mainstream commercial traditional media started playing a lesser role in our life. A lot of newspapers started starving to death. And a lot of things that look like media and look like they might be respectable and look like they might be telling the truth but aren't, started becoming a bigger part of the information that we consume every day. A lot of just what's called clickbait these days. And through social media, this stuff was really getting consumed. Since human trafficking became a topic that everyone, whatever your political ideology was, whatever your outlook on life was, this was something people cared about. And especially since there was this big foundation of fear that, oh my gosh, my kid could be next. People were really consuming that stuff, even if it wasn't exactly true. And this last line sounds really nitpicky, but we're going to talk about that later. Growing an incorrect use of the word pedophilia in this kind of clickbait stuff. Pedophilia is a medical term. It refers to an adult's consistent and persistent sexual attraction to a prepubescent child. The term got conflated very badly in the last 10 years with the act of sexually abusing a child. That's very different. And one of the things that started happening, there's a lot of debate about the role of pedophilia in child sexual abuse. There's one school of thought that says it's a primary driver. There's another school of thought that says it's a very minimal driver. One of the things that social media allowed to happen was lots of academic, scientific type folks who had a blog or an article or even like a TED Talk about thinking intelligently about pedophilia. That narrative got twisted. Thinking intelligently and humanely about it became twisted to saying we need, academics, look at these horrible academics. They are saying we need to be nice and humane and intelligent when it comes to dealing with people who molest children. That's not the point. That's not even the content. But one of the things that happened with social media and with all the clickbait and all the stuff that all of the media consumption trends that started was we stopped reading the articles quite as thoroughly, if even at all. There's a statistic that more than 50% of people who share an article on social media don't read it. And again, when you're talking about something that people are afraid of, people don't understand much, but everybody is emotionally attached to it and everybody gets worked up about it, that's a very quick way to get a lot of misinformation and a lot of stuff out there. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so 2016, we had a very contentious presidential election that year. One candidate and the spouse of the other candidate were both known to have spent time with Jeffrey Epstein, a very, well, at this point, everyone knows the story. I'm not even going to go into it. But even by 2016, Epstein's name and what he was up to was starting to get a little more press. Flanking the election, a rumor started circulating through Twitter, Reddit, and 4chan concerning children being sexually trafficked through a pizza shop in Washington, D.C. And according to this rumor, this was being masterminded by Hillary Clinton and her cronies. This was known as Pizzagate. And the conspiracy theory didn't really stop until an armed gunman arrived to the pizzeria, shot it up, got arrested. So all of a sudden we went from people, people were aware of some, people had heard about this, to all of a sudden people are talking about this and thinking, oh my gosh, I figured this out. There's this conspiracy going on here. No one's talking about it. I'm figuring it out. It's kind of a big jump. What people didn't realize is there have been conspiracies, there have been rumors of stuff like this going on for a long time. We're going to get into that more shortly. When I first heard about, actually the way I first heard about Pizzagate was a journalist I know, a freelance journalist I know, who I have a lot of respect for, emailed me and she's like, what do you think about all this? I'm like, I'm like, well, it's a really interesting story, but here's what we do know about human trafficking. It's almost never involves prepubescent children, especially when there's any kind of an organization to it. To be able to pull this off as it's being described would just be completely unprecedented. It would be completely unlike anything else that's ever been happened. I can't say with 100% certainty it's not going on, but it's really unlikely. This is really not how that operates. And that worked with her. I told her that. She believed it. She acknowledged that she didn't know that, and that was that. But that was a journalist, someone who's intelligent and willing to listen. But it shows that even among intelligent people, even among educated people who write about this topic, and by the way, that's how I crossed paths with this journalist. She writes routinely about issues of sexual exploitation. So, and that's, she was willing to trust me as an expert on that. But for people who are intelligent and are in this movement to not recognize why this is a problem, to not recognize what sounds fishy about this, kind of when I started realizing, the human trafficking narrative is kind of spinning in a way we don't want it to spin. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the birth of QAnon. So in November of 2017, this is the version of it you will always hear media talk about it. An anonymous poster in 4chan, which is a very nasty, misogynistic social media network where pretty much the stuff that gets you kicked off of any other social media network that any of us may partake in will not get you kicked off 4chan. Somebody there said they had high-level military clearance and they were aware that President Trump and select pieces of the military were working to free this big, huge ring of children who are being sexually trafficked to global elites, and it was entirely being run by the Democrats. So okay, when I tell, that sounds ridiculous to an awful lot of people, especially when you're not thinking about it in any kind of context or any of the historical context of this. It sounds pretty silly. It's important to realize that it isn't really as silly as it sounds. So the basic tenets of QAnon are that there is this group of elite pedophiles who, who are immensely important, have massive political power, and who are funding and responsible for this significant traffic of prepubescent children. So, okay, so, and that Hollywood isn't, the other piece that Hollywood is always involved. Hollywood always gets brought up in this. So again, this sounds really silly. And a lot of when you see a lot of the bits of this, it is silly, but it is plausible. So let's take a look at the biggest piece of what QAnon believes, that there's this global cabal, is the term they usually use, of sex offenders. So incidentally, long before QAnon, long before 4chan existed, long before most social media existed, the phrase pedophiles rule the world was bandied around a lot among survivors turned advocates, not significant advocates, not people who run the big national organizations. But this phrase is being kicked around an awful lot. And people are right now listening to this and they're saying, I listen to the news, I watch every TV series Mariska Haggerty makes. I don't believe that. No one can believe that. We take child sex abuse very seriously. We do in some ways, we don't in other ways. I want you to take a look at this from a different way here. So with child sex abuse, right now, the statistics most people use is that only about 10% of survivors, 10% of abusers will ever see a day behind bars. That's not really encouraging. So why is that? Well, part of that is because we have big structural things in place that keep a lot of cases from going forward. Statute of limitations on the crime is one huge one. We don't like it when an institution keeps abusing kids again and again, but it keeps happening. The Catholic Church has been involved in scandals for about 30 years regarding child sex abuse. A whole generation has grown up with this being one of if they hear something about the Catholic Church in the headlines on the news, there's probably a scandal involving sexual abuse. This has been a big part of our culture for 30 years. It's been really big for 20 years after the Boston Globe broke their story, but they still exist. In 2020, nearly 100,000 people filed suit against Boy Scouts of America for child sexual abuse. The reason it happened all at once was because Boy Scouts were actually declaring bankruptcy, and because they've been sued so many times before, and they wanted to basically tell everyone who was going to sue, let's just get it over with right now so we can get you taken care of in the bankruptcy agreement. That's a huge number. And even though this is going to sound like a meme I'm going to pick apart in a few minutes, it was barely a blip on our media radar last year. Granted, we had a lot going on last year, but nearly 100,000 people saying they'd been sexually abused by a single institution, and that single institution is still there. That's a problem. It does can make somebody wonder how seriously we really take this idea. If you look at the issue of child sexual abuse from an individual's point of view, it's really, really rare that you hear somebody who says, yeah, I'm happy with the way law enforcement and other governmental agencies handled my case. And I want to tell you two stories that illustrate that. This might be a little uncomfortable for some people. So last summer, a friend of mine texted me and was like, Melanie, I need to talk with you immediately. Something happened. So we talk. And I found out that what happened was her 4-year-old granddaughter had said that she'd been sexually abused by her 11-year-old half-brother. So I was talking with her, and what the child described was absolutely not any kind of a normal behavior. And the age gap, the developmental gap between a 4-year-old and an 11-year-old is very significant. This was not a normal thing for the 11-year-old to be doing. So we talked about what should be done by the family and what she could expect afterwards. And so with an 11-year-old child, no one is really going to want to press charges on them, but you do want to investigate and you do want to figure out why this 11-year-old is doing that, because it's not normal. And usually when a child that young is behaving like that, it's usually because they themselves have experienced sexual abuse. It could be because somebody is showing them pornography to ready them for further sexual abuse. It could be there's so little supervision in the child's home that he's got nothing better to do than look at pornography on his phone. That's still a problem. But it's still, this is, even though no one is going to arrest the 11-year-old, there still needs to be investigation. Now, this friend of mine runs a PR firm, so she's very good at getting people, when she tells them to jump, very often they say how high. So, we talked, we went over all this. I talked with her about a month later and wanted to know what was going on. She said, so yeah, the police showed up to the house and the mom wasn't home. And I paused. I wanted to let her finish the sentence. And then there was more silence and I realized she was done. So I'm like, wait, so when did this happen? It's like, 2 weeks ago. So the police showed up. The child's mother was not home. They left. That was it. That was 100% of the investigation. The only reason they got that much investigation, I think, was because grandma runs a PR firm and they wanted to do something. If she had been me or most other people on the street, I don't think that much would have happened. When you hear a story like that, it makes you wonder how seriously we take child sexual abuse. Another story was a woman who emailed my organization asking for help. She also had a 4-year-old child. She was divorced from the father. The child saw the father on weekends. The child was coming back home from father touching her genital area, touching mom's genital area, doing all this stuff that's not normal for a 4-year-old to do. She asked her what was going on. She said daddy was touching her there. So mom did what was she supposed to do. She called CPS. CPS said, okay, we're going to arrange for the child to have a forensic interview at a child advocacy center. They do that. While the girl was having her forensic interview, she said that daddy would have her take all her clothes off. He would take all his clothes off. He would have her lay down on her Peppa Pig mattress, and he would put his finger in her butt. And it really, really, really hurt. Sometimes he'd have her lay down on her stomach and it hurt less. This all got documented in the forensic interview. The interviewer utterly believed the child and said the child was telling the truth. CPS, I don't know how much of that report they actually read, but the CPS worker said, well, the kid keeps talking about her father touching her butt. Touching a child's butt is not sexual. So I'm not indicating the case. The police said, well, if CPS isn't going to indicate, they have a lower burden of proof than we do. We're not even going to investigate it. The judge presiding over the case said, well, I know what's going on. CPS isn't going to indicate, the police aren't investigating. Mom is just alienating the child from the father. Mom is trying to get a leg up in the custody proceedings. So we're going to give the child to the father, and the mom's going to get 2 supervised visits a month. So when you live through that, and about 26,000 parents go through that every year, go through the same issues with CPS, police, and family courts, making a perfect storm. When you go through that, it starts to seem very plausible that the government, there actually is some big conspiracy of governmental influential sex offenders who are out there preying on children. Occam's razor says the simplest explanation for a problem is likely the correct one. And I'm sorry, unless you have a lot of background and training and understanding how cases like that happen, Occam's razor does really point to some conspiratorial thing. Part of my job at the Stop Abuse campaign is I work with a lot of moms in the same situation that mom is in. And I have seen a lot of them get into QAnon because it's logical to them when they have seen so much government inaction and seen the government behave so badly. Yes, of course it makes sense that this is, that there is this big cabal of elite pedophiles preying on children with impunity. It makes sense to them. And if you're that child who grows up, if that was you 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 40 years ago, it makes sense. Okay, next slide. So what's the emotional payout of believing in this? What's the emotional payout? Why is it that people believe in this conspiracy theory? Because they've seen, on whether directly or not, how little we value protecting children. And it's very validating to see that other people see the world the same way you do. These moms who lose custody of their kids for reporting abuse, each one of them feels like they're the only one in the whole wide world. The moms who are trying to get the police, even if, let's say, it's not their, not the child's father who has legal ties to the kid, if it's their stepfather and they're just trying to get a conviction. The people who just see the police not convict, things like that, people don't even believe them. So to see other people, even if they're not saying why they believe these things, but to see that other people do, it's comforting. It's very reassuring to believe that someone out there is trying to protect children, especially if what you've seen with your own life experience is that people don't always do that. I think for that mother who I described in the last story, it's got to be easier for her to believe that, to get up in the morning, if she thinks, even if she doesn't really believe it, even if she just thinks in the back of her mind, maybe there are people who are working to right the wrongs, maybe not that her child's going through, but that some of them are. that's got to make it easier to get through the day. There's this element with people who got into these, and we started seeing it with Pizzagate of, hey, I'm the one who's going to figure this out. I'm looking at all these clues. This is very rewarding. A lot of people have been writing about that recently as they talk about QAnon. And interesting thing is that anything, they compare it to video games and video game addiction. People who are a group of people who are more likely to get addicted to anything, whether it's drugs or behaviors, are abuse survivors. This is not something anyone has done any research into, but I think it's worth thinking about. It's very, very validating for people to think that, hey, if I spend enough time reading this stuff and thinking about this, I might be able to save children. All of us in the human trafficking movement, I think, have had volunteers show up expecting that they're going to, the first day they volunteer, say, okay, we're going to go and break the windows out of a brothel and pull out all these children. Obviously, that's a very validating thing. It's a very, that would be great. That would be a very rewarding thing to do. People want that. People think they can do that rather than by going to RRCAHT meetings. Now people think they can do it digitally. It's very reassuring to think that it's billionaires who are causing all the problems, because most of us are never going to meet a billionaire. A part of this narrative with this underground sex trafficking of prepubescent kids is that it all goes back, it relies on kidnapping. People believe that all these kids are getting kidnapped. Again, the fact that it's only about 100 a year is not well known. The fact that there aren't enough kidnappings possibly to support this doesn't really sink into people, because that fact has never gotten as etched in our public consciousness as the fear of kids being kidnapped. But yeah, if you believe that the only people who are going to sexually harm kids are billionaires and not your sister's boyfriend who you get a creepy vibe from, well, that's great. That means you can let your sister's boyfriend babysit your kid while you're online researching child sex abuse. And something that is very possible people are getting from QAnon, from these social media networks where they're talking about this endlessly, is mutual support. People who have, whether it's from their own lived experience of being abused, whether it's from seeing how badly the system can treat people, whatever, there's got to be an element of mutual support there, which they don't get enough of. Next slide. Okay. So this groundwork has been going on for a while. The skeleton of these conspiracy theories has been kicking around for a while. No one was really talking about it much until 2020, which seems like a distant memory here. So about 13 months ago, we were faced with a once-in-a-lifetime global pandemic. Most of us were spending a ridiculous amount of time home, a ridiculous amount of time online. There was also epic racial unrest going on in the country due to police brutality. We had a presidential election that made the 2016 one look tame. The partisan divide between news, between how people consume their information, is becoming very apparent because people were looking at scientific stuff differently. The role of government in people's day-to-day lives got drastically changed. So, we're kind of primed for something. Okay, next slide. Okay, so QAnon that had been kicking around, this conspiracy theory that had been kicking around for a while, suddenly started becoming very politically advantageous to the Republican Party. And a lot of specific misinformation stuff started working its way on social media. I just want to look at that real quick because a picture's worth 1,000 words. Next slide. Okay. So one whole genre of memes, which are just the simplest ways to communicate, but incredibly powerful because of that simplicity. We had a whole genre kicking around showing that trying to portray child sex trafficking is a bigger issue than the pandemic. Problem with that is child sex abuse, first of all, is much less common. Second of all, those numbers are fairly static, whereas the thing with a virus is more and more people keep getting it. And whatever number you may have at some point in time, it's going to keep increasing. Next slide. There were a lot of hyper-partisan memes focusing on saying that Republicans are the ones who are interested in fixing this. Again, this is not based in truth, but it was in the context of everything else that's been going on and that had been fed to people have been consuming for the last couple of years. It was logical. It made sense. Next slide. This whole genre of memes about how is finding blankety number of missing children in blankety state, and I saw these things for every imaginable state and any imaginable quantity of children. Not the biggest news story in America. Well, these are so sneaky because it's implying this really, really highly organized level of significant child trafficking, which never happens. But since people didn't realize that, it was plausible. And it's also the very nature of this is to make people distrust the news, make people distrust the mainstream media, because it's like, oh, this happened. Because when we all believe first person narrations, a meme is sort of a narrator. You know, it's for that fleeting moment when you're reading this, you're thinking about believing it, even, which means, yes, this little tidbit, you're likely to trust that more than your local news station. And again, it was just feeding into this whole, the whole conspiracy about this. Okay, next slide. A whole genre of memes about pedophilia disinformation. So this one, oh my gosh, I had to issue massive edicts in my organization that people were not to ever, under any circumstances, talk about California, quote unquote, legalizing pedophilia. That did not happen. This whole SB 145, which was an actual piece of legislation, was spun into so much disinformation, and entirely in a partisan way. Because it was actually based on a true bill. SB 145 allowed judges to, at their discretion, keep young people off the sex offender registry if they committed certain kinds of sex crimes when there was no evidence of force or coercion. Basically, similarly aged teenagers, but one of them is over the age of 18, were consensually engaging in sexual activity. They had the option to not put them on the sex offender registry. Now that sounds a little concerning, but there was already legislation on the books in California that allowed that if the crime that the minor had committed was vaginal intercourse. What SB 145 did was allowed judges to have that same discretion if any other sexual contact, in the context of any other sexual contact. Some people still were still uncomfortable about this. So for those people who are, one other really important fact that has never worked its way into the public consciousness, there is absolutely no discernible benefit in terms of public health, public safety, in terms of the number of children who are abused, from no metric that we can find whatsoever. There is no reason to believe that sex offender registries actually do anything. This was really not a significant blow to children's welfare or safety, but it was a huge source of disinformation. And I'm seeing advocates who know me, and I'm seeing people who are very serious about this and very well schooled on this, talking about this. It, again, made me realize this has really gone too far. Okay, next slide. So towards the summer, right before Facebook started cracking down on what they were allowed to do in terms of fact checking, we got the Save the Children movement, which, by the way, was usurping somebody else's, another not-for-profit's actual name. And they it became a feeder for QAnon by using stuff like this, portraying very, very simple, but very, very stereotyped images about protecting children and child safety. And Save the Children succeeded in having rallies around the country, including in Rochester. I wasn't able to attend the local one. I would have loved to, just as an observer. But I've tried to organize actual rallies for child abuse when you're actually trying to involve real stories going on in your neighborhood, real legislative advocacy, real solutions. Can't get people out the door for that. But apparently, when you boil it down to no facts and just emotions, it works. So between October of 2020 and January of 2021, Facebook did start cracking down on a lot of this stuff. And the rest of social media followed quickly. Trump lost the election. QAnon supporters were prominent in the January 6th. I'm sorry, next slide. Were prominent in the January 6th insurrection attempt. And after Biden got inaugurated, a lot of people, since that was the final bit of the QAnon mythos kind of disintegrating, a lot of people backed off it, realized, oh, I was wrong. There never was anything to this. A lot of people didn't and just bought into it even further, which is very much what researchers have shown happens with like doomsday cults. You predict the world is going to end on one particular day. It doesn't. Some people realize, oops. Other people like, no, we just miscalculated. And they remain loyal to the cult. Since this is best viewed as part of a myth, part of a cultural truth in our society that serves a purpose, this is not going to go away. We need to keep talking about this. We need to be mindful. We need to continue being mindful of this. And the whole entire human trafficking realm needs to do better. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what we need to start doing better here to try to get ahead of this. Next slide. Okay. So what we need to be absolutely certain we are doing at all times. We need to use good numbers. We do not need to go around conflating numbers with domestic numbers with international numbers. You do not need to conflate numbers of adult victims and child victims. You do not need to conflate different types of trafficking. Just be honest. If there's not a number, we can say that. That's okay. If it's a small number, that's okay. We can say that too. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is a huge multi-million-dollar organization founded on a crime that happens to 100 children a year. If they can do it, the rest of us can do it. We need to start going on the offense against misinformation. That was something that nationally didn't start happening until last summer when QAnon types were choking up the hotline for Polaris, saying, "Oh, hey, have you heard about this? What do you think about this? What's going on?" It was actually preventing real people from doing real work. That was the point when people started talking about it, but we should never have let it get to that point. We need to go on the offense about that. When we see misinformation, we need to just say, no, that's actually not right. This is the truth. We need to stop victim creep. There is a storytelling term in storytelling, especially in serial storytelling, like comic books or series, when the hero has to get more and more powerful with every episode to keep it interesting, and the bad guy has to get more and more powerful with every episode. As the mythos of human trafficking and child sex abuse in the United States, we've gotten into victim creep, which is the opposite of that. Our victims need to keep getting more and more perfect, more and more young. We don't need to do that. We've already got an incredibly powerful narrative. So when we're talking about the minors that our agency helps, you don't need to say, minors as young as 13. You can just say teenagers. Because when we start putting the focus on the younger kids, since we're making them more perfect victims, we don't need to do that. It's building into really bad, really destructive cycle. We need to believe survivors. We need to be very out there and very public about that. If you are in a situation where, if it's your agency, if it's someone very close to you who's being investigated for misconduct with a minor, you can say, we're going to let the investigation proceed or something like that. But we need to believe survivors, because a world that doesn't usually believe survivors is kind of how we got into this in the first place. At least that's part of it. And we need to understand commercial child sex abuse, non-commercial child sex abuse. If you are an agency that works with trafficked people, understand the dynamics of non-commercial sex abuse, vice versa. Because we are all, in the eyes of the public, who doesn't read beyond the headlines, we are experts, and we are the ones who have the power of straightening their worldview out to some extent. A lot of the times when I found myself talking with someone who's full on into QAnon, full on into the conspiracy theories, they don't care. But people who are asking about it, a lot of the times they're asking about it, they want a little bit of an emotional feedback, and they do want to know some facts. Sometimes you can turn them around just with facts. We got to do that, because this is not going to go away. There's a lot of things we need to do to make this world a fairer and a more just place for survivors. And one of the things we can do to keep it from blowing up in the meantime is to at least educate people, engage their more rational minds, and just get the truth out there. We've got an incredibly important story to tell. We can do it the right way, and people are still going to be receptive to it. So thank you so much. Do we have any questions? Let me go back into Zoom here. And I apologize, this took a little longer than I was expecting it to, but if I'm not going anywhere if you aren't.
Hi there.
Hello.
Thank you, Melanie, for your presentation. Amazing information. Thank you so much. So I don't think we have any questions just yet. We are a little bit behind schedule, so please feel free to ask any questions you would like. We are recording this. We will get it out to you. We have one question. Melanie, what do you think of New York State giving victims letters stating that they have been identified as victims?
Okay, so that's a practical, so from a practical point of view, that we need to do that, because we do live in a world where we are much more concerned about letting somebody who isn't a good enough victim get something than somebody who is a good enough victim not get something. So I completely understand the practical aspect, the practical reason for doing that. You can't just say, I mean, we don't believe victims, we don't believe survivors when they talk to us in general. So I understand the practical reason for having that letter. From a survivor's point of view, I don't think that's a great, I'm sure that causes a lot of emotional upheaval. It's saying I'm good enough. It's saying my story's good enough. Somebody actually believes me. I mean, that is validating. But to say that, I'm not, I'm not worthy unless I get this, that's not validating. And I'm sure, I don't know the statistics for the number of cases that get approved, but I'm sure it's not 100% or anything close to that. So, I mean, I think it's a necessary evil. Without a lot of big structural changes, those letters are necessary.
Thank you. How about, what are your thoughts on the Wayfair scandal?
Oh, goodness. That was kind of when I started realizing that this is really, people are really losing their minds on this. But again, people would not have thought that was plausible if they had a better understanding of how this works. It perfectly plays into the mythos. There's people out there who have enough money, they can just go onto a website and buy a child. That's actually amused me a couple times when I think about it. Either the people who believe that either have never worked for a big company and they don't understand how many different people are responsible for receiving an order, for fulfilling it, for packaging it, for shipping it out. Because if you've ever worked for a big company, you realize it's a lot of people. So either they don't realize that, they think Wayfair is like one guy who does everything, or they really believe that there are so many people in the world who are so apathetic to this that you know, you've got hundreds of people working who all know that they're selling kidnapped children for sexual exploitation, and everyone's okay with it. I can very easily see how the second is plausible to people. I also see how the first one is too, but that's a little more optimistic.
Thank you. So kind of similar questions, kind of follow-up-ish, a little bit separate. What's the connection to Hollywood?
Okay. So Hollywood is involved. There are a lot of child sex abuse scandals kicking around in Hollywood. And I actually had some notes on that, but kind of skipped it because I was going a little long. There are actors who have been credibly accused of sexually abusing children. There, Charlie Sheen and Kevin Spacey being two of them. Kevin Spacey, I know, has an active lawsuit against him that was from a minor who says he was sexually assaulted by him in New York and who sued under the Child Victims Act. That is, and there's a couple good documentaries about that, and Open Secret is one of them that you can see for free on Vimeo. There's a couple others that have come out more recently. There are a few directors who have been credibly accused of child sex abuse. Bryan Singer, who did X-Men, is one of them. And even more, the people who are probably do the most of it are not the household names, but agents, and a lot of the agents who work with child actors and people who work in that line of work, the people who actually have the most access to children. A lot of them have been convicted of child sex abuse. There are actually laws saying that if you've been convicted of child sex abuse, you're not allowed to be an agent for children, but they're not widely enforced. So this is something that's percolating around in Hollywood, and it has been for a while. Hollywood is not a big monolith, so it's, there's different, it's not like everyone who works in procuring actors and agenting for actors and directors, they don't all know each other, they don't all work together. It's not as huge and as organized as a lot of people make it out to be, but yes, Hollywood does have a lot of problems with that. And just like we see in every other institution, with every other kind of abuse scandal, you do have people with a lot of money. You have the whole cultural and economic backbone of a city at stake. People are very willing to look the other way.
I'm going to jump to something else and then kind of come back to some of the media stuff. So survivors still have to jump through so many hoops to get resources. Do you have any recommendations to address this?
We need to understand that. We need to be as a world, we need to be a lot more compassionate to survivors. We need to understand that there are no perfect victims in this world. And a lot of these survivors, they are not like that one little child who's being kidnapped. They grow up and they do things we wish they wouldn't do, and they live lives we wish they wouldn't live. And sometimes they commit crimes. And if we're really, really punitive about what resources are available to people with criminal records, we're hurting survivors. And if we're really punitive with people who abuse drugs, we're hurting survivors. We need to really understand that as a culture. We need to, if we say that we are, the child sex abuse is important to us, then we need to be accommodating to its victims, even the victims who present in ways that we don't really like.
All righty, thank you. We'll do one more question and then we're gonna wrap it up. Melanie, is there a way that someone can contact you? Do you want them to reach out to just RCAHT in general, or do you want to put any contact information out there?
I mean, you can reach out to RRCAHT in general. You could email info@stopabusecampaign.org. I answer that. So
Yeah, so please feel free, for all of our attendees, feel free to check out our website, just rcat.org, rrcaht.org. So let's take one last final question. How about, what do you think about victims coming forward after 20 years of abuse and being able to take their abusers to court?
okay, so again, this statutes of limitations are one of the big structural things we put in place that keeps abusers on the street and keeps victims from seeing any kind of justice. We know that it takes on average 21 years for a sex abuse survivor to disclose their abuse. That means for every little child who discloses while they're still a little child, there's somebody well into middle age who's never told a soul about it. If we want a world where there's accountability, where abusers do have the option of, might actually experience consequences, those statutes of limitations cannot be there, or they need to be at the very least very flexible. There needs to be ways around them. I mean, in New York, we passed SOL reform, and we passed it. It took us 15 years to get a very, very humble extension, but we got it. And after New York got it, a lot of other states have passed it as well. It's always an ongoing thing because no state wants to fix it all at once. But it's absolutely a crucial thing we need to do if we want survivors to feel that we care, that we do care about them, we do take their experience seriously, and we are willing to impose consequences on the bad guys.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for sticking it out with us for a couple extra minutes. Thank you, Melanie, for all of your information and answering all of these questions. Just to remind everyone, we will have this is recorded. We will have this out to everybody in the next couple of days. Please check us out online. Reach out to us if you have any additional questions that you really would like answered. We are here to provide information. So thank you again, Melanie, for providing so much. And thank you to all of our attendees. We really appreciate you sticking it out with us tonight and joining us in the first place. Thanks.